we're in the middle of this series called Swipe Right. And in general, when we talk about swipe right, we're talking about dating apps. But we know that in our culture that some of these dating apps are no longer dating apps, but hookup apps. They just skip past all, 20 blocks from dating, from I get to meet you to marriage. They just skip right to sex. Just swipe right and we can make it happen. And we've been talking about how our society has become sexualized and how this is not how God desired it. And for first week, Alan talked about I gotta have it, this whole attitude that I just gotta have it or I'm gonna die. And he talked about how we live in a culture that refuses to be patient, right? We don't know how to be patient for stuff. And then he talked about how the other problem of gotta have it is this idea that God's plan is not as good as ours. We don't think God really has a lot of good stuff for us, or it's as good as people say it is, and so we live into what we think should be the plan. And then the week after that, we talked about for a happy meal and a smile. And we talked about, I remember it because I preached it. But I told a story of the pineapple and how when the pineapple was found by the Europeans when they came over to South America and they took it back to Europe, they were selling pineapple for $8,000. And they wouldn't eat these pineapples. They would just set it up on in a really lofty place and let people look at it and say, look at that, that's my pineapple. Because it was expensive. They treat it like art. But now pineapples you can buy for $2. And that is basically what has happened to sex. That it used to be so valuable. And we used to view it kind of like God viewed it. And now all of a sudden we've cheapened it. And then last week, Alan dealt with the idea of it's more than you know. And this whole attitude that we don't really even have a good understanding of why God created sex and what it's designed to do. And so he walked through how God desires us, the context in which sex is okay for him, but also why that context is so important. Why did God create this? Why? What does this do? And this week, what I want to talk about is the title is It's Not Over Till It's Over. And I have to tell you, when me and Alan were talking about through this series and determining who was going to preach what, I was hoping I'd get this one. Because every time I hear something like it's not over till it's over, it takes me back to 1984. And it takes me back to when I was about 10 years old. And you have to understand, if you're younger than me, you have to understand that Saturday was a major day for kids in America back in the day. Because, see, we didn't have a Cartoon Network. We only got to see cartoons on Saturday. And so you can believe we got up early to check a cartoon out. And we even had our I'm going to turn it to this one, for this one, this one, this one. But that's not even all. At 12 o'clock on Channel 20, you could watch the Kung Fu movie of the week. Whoa, you just don't know. And so, listen, every Saturday I get them to do my chores because my mom's like, you ain't watching anything until your chores are done. Them bad boys get done at 6 in the morning, okay? And I would start clicking through my channels and getting my shows and watching them and doing all this stuff. And one day, I got through all my cartoon, and I went to click the Kung Fu movie of the week, and I clicked, and I hit a channel, and I saw something that I had never saw before. And it changed my life. I saw WWF Wrestling, the World Wrestling Federation. I clicked it. I was like, click, click. I put it back. I said, wait a minute. What is this? These dudes are jumping off top ropes, putting elbows on people, slamming people, flipping them out of the ring. This is speaking to me. And you have to know, I know, you got to understand, at 10 years old, you couldn't tell me it was fake. I realize some of you are hating right now, like, oh, it's all fake. Let me just get that out of the way so you don't have to hate for the rest of the sermon. It was fake, okay? But you couldn't tell a 10-year-old. So anyway, and what was so great about the WWF is they had all these characters. Like Junkyard Dog and the Road Warriors, the tag team, and they had King Kong Bundy, and they had the Iron Sheik who put you in this camel clutch that everybody tried on their friend at least once. But my favorite of all time, and I'm wearing his shirt today, is Hulk Hogan, because he had Hulkamania. And it was like mania. Hulk would come on, and it'd be crazy because he was my favorite wrestler for 3 reasons. He would get on, Mean Gene, who was the announcer, would get on and be like, Hulk, you're about to fight so-and-so, and he was talking all this junk. And Hulk, first of all, he talked a certain way. He'd be like, let me tell you something, brother. How many of you know that's how he talked? He'd be like, I'm listening. I'm listening. As a Hulkamaniac, I sat up like, I'm with you. And he was like, me and my Hulkamaniacs are going to take him out. And I'm like, I'm with you because I'm a Hulkamaniac. And so I felt like I was a part of Hulk Hogan because anytime he was down and got up or whatever, he would say, it was my Hulkamaniacs. And I was like, that was me. I was cheering you on through the television. The second thing Hawk would do that just was inspiring to me is when he would get in the ring, he would rip his shirt off. You do not understand as a little boy what this does to a boy. To see this mountain of just muscle rip a shirt off. You can believe I tried to rip a shirt off. I tried every Saturday to rip a shirt off when he ripped his shirt off. And I couldn't do it. So one day I cut the shirt just a little bit right here. And then I ripped that bad boy off when he did it. And I was walking around feeling real strong until I felt the backhand of my mom on my butt because I had tore his shirt up. But the real reason why I loved Hawk is because he would get in these matches sometimes and it would just seem like he was beaten, that he was down, that the opponent was faster, stronger, smarter, right? They've been jumping off the ropes, hitting him with chairs, doing whatever. And all of a sudden they had him pinned. And if you don't know about wrestling, they count to 3 and the match is over. And it'd be like 1, 2. And as they lift a hand to do 3, guess what Hawk would do? He'd kick out. He'd kick out. Not only would he kick out, he would start to get up. And the dude would still be hitting him and doing it. And Hawk would get up. And if you know anything about Hawk, he'd start shaking. And as a little kid, I'd shake too, like, oh, step. Because he would do like this. And then his whole body was shaking. This dude would still be hitting him. He's like, and then he'd just go to town. And see, somehow in a match, Hulk Hogan got a second breath, got a second set of energy. And you always knew with Hawk that it wasn't over until it was over. You always knew that the match wasn't over until it was over, no matter what had gone on during the match. And that is what I want to talk about today, because for some of us, we're in a wrestling match with sex, and we're losing. We've been in a wrestling match with sex, and we've been losing. And sex has been dropping it on us, dropping bows on us, jumping off the top rope, and we have broken marriages from it. We have unplanned child from it. We have diseases. We have heartbreak from it. We are lonely by ourselves. And it just seems like this opponent sex is just, he's beating you. And I want you to know something, that just like Hulk Hogan, it's not over until it's over. And I want you to understand this, that no matter what bad choices you made, and I think we got to call them bad choices and sinful choices and not play games with it, but I want you to understand that no matter what bad choices or sinful choices you made with sex, that it is not over, that God has not given up, that God is your tag team partner, and that he wants to give you a second chance. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to look at a woman in the Bible today who, for all intents and purposes, she was a slave to sex. And it should have ruined her life. She should have had regrets. She should have been like, I just don't even care to go on. The count should have got to 3, but something happens in the middle of the story, and she gets a second chance. And I want to look at her second chance, because I think if we can process with her how it played out, we can also do some of the same things to have a second chance. And I want to say this to you before I pray and then we jump in, that some of you say, well, I'm not struggling with sex right now. I can promise you that each one of us in here is struggling with some sinful behavior, though, and it seems to be kicking our butt. I can promise you. And so if the context for you is not sex, then it's something else, and you should still lean in and hear what I have to say. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you that you came so that we have a second chance. That humanity has a second chance to have a relationship with you, which leads to salvation, which leads to freedom from so much of the mess that we think is so good for us until we're in chains to it. And so I'm just thankful, Lord, for you in my life and the second chance. And I just pray that you would show up and you would do kingdom business with each person in this room, whatever the sinful unfruitful behavior is in their life, whatever they're struggling with, whatever the opponent is that seems to have them down on the mat and the count is 2, that you will begin to speak to their heart and let them know that you desire for them to have a second chance. In Jesus' name, amen. So this lady that I want to talk about today is Rahab. And we can find it in the chapter of Joshua, chapter 2, the book of Joshua, chapter 2. And Rahab, what I need to do is I'm going to read a small portion of what I want to read today, and then I need to give you some background. I need to fill in some of the holes. That way I don't have to read chapter 1 and all of chapter 2. I can just give you some context and background, and then once I give you that context and background after this first part of the scripture, then you'll understand what you need to understand, so then we can process what she did to get her second chance, okay? So bear with me. Joshua 2, 1, verse 1b to 4. So they went, and I'm going to tell you who they are in a moment, and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and spent the night there. The king of Jericho was told, some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come only to search out the whole land. Spy. But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, true, the men came to me, but I do not know where they have come from. She goes on to say, I don't know where they're at now. I don't even know how they got out of here. I don't even know which way they ran. So the 3 questions that I need to answer for you so that you understand when we start to answer the question is, who are these guys? They're spies, I can tell you that much. So who are these spies? Why are they spying? And then let's talk a little bit more about Rahab, because I think we need to understand some things about her. All you hear in this story right now, she's a prostitute, but I need to unpack that for you a little bit. So these men were spies. They were Israelite spies, Jewish spies. And you have to know that the Israelites for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years were enslaved. They were slaves to the Egyptians. And even before they were slaves to the Egyptians, their God, the one only true God, had spoke to them and said, I have promised land for you. I'm going to set you up. And so they got into slavery, and I don't want to go into why that happened and all this stuff, but they were in slavery for hundreds of years. God showed up. God freed them miraculously from Egypt, which is one of the greatest powers of that time. They were like the Rome of that time. They were unbelievably big as a nation. And so God miraculously, he did all these miracles to get the Pharaoh to move a little bit. And then the Pharaoh lets them go, and they leave, and they are starting to look for the promised land that the God had promised them. And Pharaoh catches up with them at a sea, so now they're closed in. And God opens up the Red Sea, and they walk right across while they're looking at everything in the sea. And they get across, and now they're moving into this promised land. And then they do some other dumb stuff I don't want to talk about. But eventually, God says, all right, let's go take this land, and we're going to go conquer all these people who are living there now. And miraculously, they go conquer one after other, and it's miraculous stuff that's happening in order for them to do this, okay? The next city is Jericho, and they show up to spy, to get some intel, because they're about to go wreak havoc on Jericho, okay? So that's why these spies are there. That's who they are. Now let's set that aside. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about Rahab. It says that she was a prostitute, and I need to talk through that a little bit with you. I'm glad Alan took the time last week to introduce you to this idea that there was temple prostitutes. This was way before Corinth, this time, but you have to understand that a lot of other false religions had many gods, and a lot of these gods, almost every religion had a god of fertility, and it wasn't just a god of fertility so you could have kids. That's not what it was about. These cultures were built on agriculture, and so they wanted their land to be fertile. They wanted it to rain. They wanted it to have good soil, and so these gods of fertility were about, look, if the soil's bad or it doesn't rain, we don't eat. Okay, so you have to understand that. And these sacred, he called them temple prostitutes. Another way to say it is sacred prostitutes. These women, which were almost all the women in the city, whether you're married or not, had to come to the temple from time to time. And you had to sit there in this big old group, and men would walk in. Now listen how crazy this is. Men would walk in, and they would look you over, see which one they like. They would drop money on the ground, not for you. That was their tithe. And I bet these brothers were tithing. And then they would choose a woman and go out and have sex with them, and that was their worship. And these women, look, if you didn't, you were considered a sinner and you could just get stoned or killed. So most scholars believe that Rahab was that kind of prostitute. She wasn't the prostitute on the street and a lot of them believe that she was a sacred prostitute, which most of the women were actually in that time, in that city, because she also had a business on the side, like an inn that she ran. And it would make no sense that she had that business running. And so to me, it doesn't really matter which one she is, but I think it's to understand that there's two types of prostitution that was going on during that time. And a lot of scholars believe she was the second. But here's what I want you to understand. Regardless of what type of prostitute she was, because even the prostitutes who did it for money, that was one of their only ways of making money. They were forced to some degree too. It was their only option. So most women were forced into stuff like this. And I want to talk about that because I can imagine the kind of wear and tear that takes on you when you are forced to do something sexually that you don't want to do. And some of you have scars from that. I'll be honest with you. God, this whole time I'm planning this sermon, God's been telling me I need to talk about my moment when I was 8 years old and I was sexually treated wrong by some dude. And I was like, I don't want to talk about that, Lord. He's like, you need to talk about it because you understand exactly how she felt. You understand that this messed with her spiritually. She's serving a God who is allowing her to be exploited. What would that make you feel about God, even though it's a false God? What would that make you feel mentally, emotionally, physically? I'm going to tell you, it messed with me. I had to go to court about this guy too. It messed with me. For years, it impacted me. For years, I thought, what did I do wrong? For years, I wondered about my value. For years, I wondered about God. And I want you to understand this because you have to know that she felt down, out, beaten, powerless. You have to understand she probably felt empty. She had questions, all sorts of questions. You have to understand she felt like Hulk Hogan on the ground and the count is 2. And she felt like there's no hope. And we need to understand that to understand how she got from there to a second chance. And a lot of times we say, oh, she was prostituting around. It's like, it was not as simple as that. And the toll it had to have taken on all those women was great. And so now, because we understand that she probably felt empty, because we understand that she probably felt powerless, because we understand that this had to have an effect on her mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically. Now I want to start talking about how. How could she have gotten a second chance? What was the process for her to get a second chance? So let's look. In Joshua 2, verses 10 and 11, it reads, "For I have heard," and this is Rahab speaking to the spies that she hid. "I have heard how the Lord, which is their Lord," she's not talking about her God, "dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what he did to the kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, and Sihon and Og, whom were utterly destroyed. As soon as we, the city of Jericho as we, heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you." And so you have to understand that she hid these spies up on her roof, and she had sent the king's army the wrong way. And now that she had lied and she had hid them, she goes up to them, and before the night falls, she wants to have a conversation with them. And she starts to have this conversation, and she said, "I heard about your God. I heard all about him. I heard how he dried up an ocean." It was the sea, but it looked like an ocean to them. He just dried it up and y'all walked over it. I heard how he just ran over. He Mack trucked these kings. I heard all about that. I heard about how when you didn't have any food to eat, he started dropping stuff out of the sky. I heard about this God. And this is what started to happen as she heard, which is the first part of the process, is she started to divert her attention from herself and was thinking about this God. And see, if we're going to have a second chance, we have to stop thinking about where we're at in our situation and the fact that the count even may be 2, and we got to start looking at God. But I'm going to tell you something. She says something here that's important to being able to divert your attention to God. She said, I have heard. I got reports. People been talking, and I've been listening. And here's what I believed happened with her. The first time she heard that this God did all this miraculous stuff to the Egyptians and they let the Israelites go, she probably was like, that's fake news. Ain't nobody. Might as well use it since everybody's using it now, right? That's some fake news right there. I'm going to tell you that right now. Ain't no God doing that. And then she probably got to, somebody came and said, girl, you did, girl. Have you heard? They done walked on dry land on the sea. And she was like, girl, that's fake news. That's fake news. And then they got across, and her other girl from the water hole was like, girl, let me tell you what I heard. He dropping meats from the sky. I don't know what kind of meat. I hope it's a rib or something, but he's dropping it. And then she probably stopped and was like, She didn't call it fake news that time. And then her friend came back. Girl, let me tell you. And you see, this kept happening. And at some point, she was like, I got to hear about this God more. At some point, it stopped being people were coming to her the stories, and I can tell you, and it started being she was looking to hear stories. She wanted to hear more. She was curious about this God. And her whole focus shifted from this crazy situation she was in to, I just got to hear more about this. She was hearing the word of the Lord, really, the testimonies of God. And I say that because I want to say this to us, that so many of us never live into a second chance. It's not that God doesn't want you to have a second chance. It's not that God hasn't prepared a second chance for you. It's that we are not good hearers of the word. We don't know anything about God. It's amazing to me how we as church people are so illiterate when it comes to the Bible. We are so illiterate about the stories of the Bible, the stories of God, what he has done. We know all about politics. We know all about who's the next rapper who's going to make it. We know all about the new video game that came out that's so sweet. We know all about the new app that just came out, the new social media platform. We know all about this stuff. But we don't hear about God. We're not in the Word on a daily basis reading and hearing about God. We're not in small groups hearing about God. We come to church once a month, maybe twice a year, and we're not hearing about God. And then we wonder why we feel so weak, so beat down, and we don't even feel like there could possibly be a second chance. It's because our attention's on us and not on God. And the reason why our attention's on us and not on God is because we're not hearing how great our God is. Can you imagine her hearing about this God? She had a God who exploited her. And all of a sudden she hears of a God who cares so much about his people, who cares about them, that he wants good things for them. Well, I got to hear more about that God. And she hears about a God who gets them out of slavery, not put them into sexual slavery, gets them out of slavery. I got to hear more about this God. And she hears about a God who makes promises about protecting and providing and taking care of. And you want to talk about feeling, I want this God to be my God. You want to talk about just wanting to absorb as much as you can about this God. It's so different from yours. I wonder what our walks would look like if we just inundated ourselves with God. 2 weeks ago, I talked about how one of the problems with sex is that we're being inundated with it. Newspapers, TV, movies, everything, music. And we're so exposed to that stuff and not exposed to God. I wonder what would happen if the people of God said, you know what, I'm going to choose to have a very little amount of all this other noise, and I'm going to spend most of my time being exposed to the stories of my God and how great he is. I already know how it would change your walk with God. I know how it would change the match that you're in, the struggle you're in with whatever sin you're in right now. I can promise you that would look totally different right now. She heard from God, which caused her to divert her attention off of herself, off of her opponent, which was that religion she was in and her king, and to God. But she didn't stop there. That was just the first part of the process. So she's starting to hear, she's starting to want to hear more about him. Now she stops focusing on herself and she's only focused on hearing about this God, because this God is totally different than the God that I know of. And then something else she did. There's a second part of the process for her. Let me just read this. In verse 11, it says, as soon as we heard, our hearts melted. As soon as we heard about your God and what he had been doing, all those crazy miracles and taking over kingdoms, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. This is what she goes on to say, though. Listen. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. You know how powerful a statement that is? Do you know that all her life she'd been raised to believe in this false God, and then she had to become a temple prostitute because that was her religion? And she probably thought the Israelites' God was a false God until she started hearing about all this stuff. And hearing it, and hearing it, and hearing it. And then she said, I believe, and this is the second part of the process of getting your second chance. I believe that your God is really big. It's bigger than my God, actually. And I believe not only is your God bigger than my God, because see, she said your God, so she hasn't fully converted all the way, but she knows now that their God is way bigger than hers. That this is a serious business God. And she started to understand that this is the biggest God, this is the true God, and this big God has a big plan for his people. I know, I'm watching as they run roughshod over all these people to take over a land that was promised them by God, that he has plans for them. Believe that a big God, in a big God with a big plan. She started to believe that. And I can imagine feeling so like I'm trapped because she had to do this or she could get stoned by being a temple prostitute. I can imagine just being a woman in that time and feeling so entrapped and not having any value unless you were married and you produced sons. I can imagine all that. And then I can imagine her hearing about a God who saves. A God who gets people out of really tough situations. A God who, when you're enslaved, can free you. And I can imagine after story after story after story after story, she began to say, this is not fake news. This is the truth. This is the true God, the one true God, the only God. And it is what causes her to do some of the things that she does. Listen to what Romans 10 says. 10:14 says, how can people call for help on the name of God if they don't know who God is? And how can they know who to trust or who God is if they haven't heard of God, of the one who can be trusted? You hear that? In Romans, it's saying we have to open up our mouth and say this stuff because the only way people are going to know about God is by hearing. And the only way they're going to have faith is by hearing. And the only way they're going to hear is if people open up their big mouths and talk. And we talk about all sorts of other stuff. Or getting in the word and hearing. The only way to build faith, it says, the only way to believe is to hear. You know, we had crazy dictators throughout the history of this world who understood this better than we do. You know, the Nazis, you know their crazy leader, he understood before he even came into power. He understood that if I can just get out what I believe by propaganda, if I can just get people to hear and 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 to hear, they'll start believing. And so when he was swept into power, he had done years of having people hear before that happened. And when he swept into power, he took over all the newspapers to make sure that they would only print what he wanted people to hear, because he knew if your ears were the gateway to your faith, to what you would believe. I'm saying this to you right now. When I say that we are illiterate biblically, and then you want to talk about what that impacts your faith, your ability to just stand on God. She believed that this God was bigger because she had been hearing. And then she believed that this God had a better plan and a bigger plan because of what she had been hearing. See, without that first part in this process, we don't even get to faith or belief. Or how do I stand firm when my opponent seems bigger, stronger, faster? How do I stand? And we look at these stories in the Bible like a Joseph, because that was the story I told 2 weeks ago, and how Potiphar's wife, was peeping and creeping, right? She was on him. She was on her brother. And we ask ourselves, how could he have stood against this? How, when an opponent was so great, when she was actually his boss, how could he say no? I'm going to tell you how. Because he had been hearing all his life about this God from his father. The covenant that this God made with him. He'd been hearing and hearing and hearing, and he believed it. He believed that this situation here is big and it's a problem, but it's not bigger than my God. And he believed that I could sleep around with her and maybe I stay in power here, but God has a bigger plan for me. My big God has a big plan because he had been hearing. And we refuse to be people of the word. We refuse to be people who get into the Bible. We refuse. There's a third thing that she does that's a part of this process. And we can find it in verses 12 to 16. And it says this: Now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, this is Rahab speaking to the spies. Since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me by the Lord. Now you see how this changes from your Lord to the Lord? Interesting, by the way. By the Lord, that you will in turn, will deal kindly with my family. Give me a sign of good faith that you will spare my father, mother, my brother, my sister, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. These men said to her, our lives for yours. And I want to stop right there because I can tell you what I need to tell you from there. So she had been hearing about this God, and eventually she turns from can't possibly be true to this has to be true. This is absolutely true. I can stand on this. That this God is a big God, the one big God, and has a big plan. And now what we start to see her do is the third thing. She begins to act like she's free. See, she was in chains to a society that treated women a certain way. She was in chains to this idea that she had to be a temple prostitute. But all of a sudden, somehow, she begins to act free. And we know she does because she no longer has loyalty to this king who sends these armed men to her door. And she doesn't say, yeah, they're upstairs because, all of a sudden, she acts like this ain't even her king. She's been freed from this king. She's like, I don't even know what to tell you, player. I don't know where he went. I don't know what the hell. She hit him and lied. She wasn't acting like a prostitute anymore, a temple prostitute anymore. Somehow, she seemed to be acting like an Israelite. And they were free. She began to act like she was free. She began to act upon this faith. And because she started acting upon this belief and this faith, she ripped off these chains of prostitution. She ripped off this idea that she was just a Canaanite woman. She ripped off this stuff and felt like she was free. She began to act like she was free. Can you imagine? Look how she hides the spies. That's not loyalty to the kingdom. Acting free. She lies to the king. Not loyalty to what she had been before. She sends the army. She basically tells them, I don't know where they're at. And in doing so, then when she eventually sends the spies, she sends the spies the other way. She hides the spies. She sends the spies. She helps them sneak out of the city. And then she sends them in the opposite direction. She's not acting like a Canaanite woman. She's not acting like somebody who's loyalty to the king of Jericho. She's acting like she is part of the Israelites herself. She's acting like a free woman right now, probably for the first time in her life. Begin to act like you are free. Begin to act. Begin to act. You know, one of the things I love actors and actors who are really good at what they do. And if you ever listen to an interview on an actor who's really good at what they do, they'll tell you that they have to go through a detox phase after they're done with a movie. Because they actually started believing that they were this character because they had been acting like that character for so long. And so sometimes it takes months for them to detox from that character and realize, oh, I'm not this character. Because that's the only way to make you believe and me believe that they are that character. They start acting like this character, and they start acting like it more and more and more and more until they actually believe they are that character. Start acting like you're free from this. What would a free person do? What would somebody who is free from sexual sin do? What is somebody who's free from whatever other sin or sinful behavior you're stuck in do? She was acting like an Israelite. She wasn't even acting like, she probably didn't act like she knew everybody else in the city anymore. I don't even know who they are. I'm with Jim and John because they getting out of here. And I know God's about to tear this city up. I'm with them. She heard. She diverted her focus from herself to this God and wanted to know more about this God. And in the process of knowing more and more and more about this God, she began to believe that he was the one true God, that he was the bigger God, that he's bigger than any of these other gods, and that he had a big plan, that he cared for his people, that he wanted his people to prosper, that he loved them, that he's pursuing them. And then she started to act like God was her God. She started to act like she was free from this temple prostitution, act like she was free from this society that held her down. Let me tell you what happens. Because of that, she gets her second chance. The Israelites come and destroy this whole city, but save her and her family. And guess what happens to her? She becomes an Israelite. She marries an Israelite. She acts like she's an Israelite way before she becomes one. She acts free before she becomes free. And in doing these three things, God gives her a second chance. And my question to you is do you want a second chance? Could be sexual sin. Could be something else you're stuck in that is just sinful behavior and beating you down. Do you want a second chance? Do you want to kick out of this? Do you want to win this match? And I want to ask the band and the volunteers as I'm starting to close to go ahead and get to where you need to be. Do you want a second chance? If you do, you have to do these three things. You have to divert your attention from God, and that only happens by being hearers of the word. Get in the word. Get in the word. I don't even know I want to say some fancy thing, but there's nothing fancy to say. Spend time getting to know God. Spend time listening to ministers, being in church, being in small groups. Spend time every day by yourself in the Word so that you divert your attention from yourself into God. You want a second chance? If you do this first one, you'll start believing that God's bigger than your problem, that your tag team partner, that you might be down and he might have you pinned and the count might be 2, but if you could just tag God, because God is your tag team partner, that he's bigger than this opponent that seems to be beating you right now. And I can promise you, if you get to that part of the process, you will begin to act. You will begin to act. You know, my wife used to always say when we were younger, when we were 18, 19, 20, she used to say this stuff and it'd make me get angry when she would say it. Because she would say stuff like, either call yourself something different or start living out what you say you are. Who's she talking to like that? She must not. She must not have heard about a brother. Either start living out Christianity, your actions live into it, or stop calling yourself it. How did we get married? You're like, dang, she was raw dogging a brother up in here. Act like you're free. Start living into this. You are free. If you're a child of the living God, you are free. He's already deemed you to be free. Start acting like it. What Jesus did on the cross from you frees you from anything that you think you're in bondage to. Start living into that freedom. Not only did Rahab get out and she actually became an Israelite, let me tell you how powerful her second chance was. 30 generations after her, 30 grandkids after her kid, born into her line would be Jesus. Y'all just don't. Oh, that's right. You understand that? God would choose her. God would say, not only am I going to free you from this, I'm going to make sure that when Jesus comes, he comes through your line. And that what you've experienced today, Rahab, I'm going to let the whole world experience through your line. Through Jesus. What kind of second chance is that? Some of you are not even hearing me. You're just like, Jesus has a prostitute in his genealogy? Yes, he has some crazy, look at your genealogy, same thing. Crazy folk. Jesus got some crazy folk in his line too. But hear me, not only was she free, not only did she become an Israelite and was married into that, 30 generations down, Jesus would show up on this earth for every person who ever walks this planet to give them all the second chance that his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother had. Thank you, Jesus. Let's pray.